Hello and welcome to episode 45 of Diabetics for Diabetics Radio. I am your host, Bowie Madison. Today's episode is titled Food and Blood Sugars. We're going to be talking about the constituents of our foods, macronutrients, micronutrients, how they impact our blood sugar. We'll talk about keto and carnivore, those low-carb diets, and how they can also impact our blood sugars. We'll talk about the organs involved in digestion, how we can take care of those. We'll talk about glycemic index, as well as tips and tricks for meal timing and portion control as someone with diabetes. So I'm excited for this episode. Let's go ahead and get started. If we haven't met yet, my name's Bowie. I've had type 1 diabetes for over 23 years. I have spent the past 3 years focused on healing naturally. After a random endocrinologist visit, I just realized that nothing was changing. And in the previous 20 years of having had type 1, I hadn't learned anything new about it. And that kind of upset me and opened my eyes to the trajectory for the rest of my life. And something needed to change. So I started to dive a little bit deeper into our current accepted theories on the disease. I started to poke holes in those, and with the holes that I poked, I found new areas of interest. And ever since then, I've just been expanding and sharing as I've been going along.
So, like I mentioned before, in this episode, we're going to be talking about these 5 main points: macronutrients and blood sugar impacts, low-carb diets and gluconeogenesis, foods and the organ systems responsible for digesting those foods, understanding the glycemic index, and meal timing and portion control.
So when it comes to macronutrients, we have 3 main categories to concern ourselves with: carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And we're going to talk about how each of these has a unique impact on blood sugars. And then when you combine them, they have a different synergistic effect on our blood sugars, our insulin sensitivity. And we're going to briefly touch upon micronutrients as well. Things like magnesium, fat-soluble vitamins, trace minerals, they all impact blood sugars as well.
So let's begin with carbohydrates. Now, carbs are probably the most talked about macronutrient when it comes to diabetes, and that's for a good reason, because they have the most direct and rapid impact on our blood sugars. They are broken down into glucose during digestion. Now, there are a lot of different kinds of carbs to think about. You think about how the sugar in an apple is very different than the sugar that you put in your coffee. Context has a lot to do with how your body handles carbohydrates. Now, for simple carbs, these are the carbs that are going to have a more rapid impact. There's less digestion to happen in order to extract the glucose from the food. Things with glucose in it: fructose, galactose, sucrose, lactose. And these are the foods that are going, you eat them and your blood sugars rise immediately. This could be fruit. This could be baked goods with that table sugar in it. Lots of different combinations of food that have a more rapid impact on blood sugars. There are also the complex carbs. And I know when it comes to, I'll mention whole grain specifically. It could be bread, it could be pasta. With type 1 or diabetes in general, are always encouraged to have whole wheat versions of those because complex carbs are broken down more slowly. The reason they're broken down more slowly has to do with the structure of the sugar molecules within them. Now, starch and glycogen are basically long braided strands of glucose and all the other simple carbs that have been combined in different ways. So starch is basically long strands of glucose that you find in plants, right? This is how plants store energy within their bodies. Now, there's also glycogen. This is animals' version of starch. This is basically just glucose tied into chains to be stored and used for later. Now, cellulose is very similar to starch in that it's used by plants. It's glucose molecules arranged in chains and strands. However, for cellulose, the glucose does not get digested. This is basically where dietary fiber comes from, right? Cellulose tends to be structural, so it's kind of an interesting tidbit about glucose. It can be used for structure and to help build things. It can also be used to help the nutrient for an energy source. So cellulose, anything from all plants' cell walls, the things that make them stand and grow, they are basically all grown from glucose, right? The only difference is our body can't break them down. And so our body has to work a lot harder to move them through the digestive system. So cellulose, that's where we get our fiber, starch, and glycogen, are storage molecules that take a little bit more time to break into smaller pieces. And then you have your simple carbs that are more readily available and are going to have a more rapid impact on increasing your blood sugar. So let's move on to proteins. So proteins are celebrated in the world of diabetes because of the impact they have on our blood sugar. Now, it has minimal direct impact on blood sugar, right? So it's not like, oh, you're going to eat protein, it's going to be broken down into sugar like glucose is, and your blood sugar is going to spike. However, it does have an indirect effect on it. So when you eat protein, it can stimulate the release of glucagon, which is released from the alpha cells of your pancreas. This is going to signal your liver to release stored glycogen, which is a sugar. So protein can be a middleman in increasing your blood sugars. However, it won't be direct. The reason protein is celebrated is because of its stabilizing role. Protein, when it's combined with carbohydrates, will slow how quickly your body digests it. So it can really help stabilize blood sugars and prevent those rapid spikes after a meal, because your body has to work a little bit harder to break it down and move it through your digestive system. Now, we'll go up just one more to this point here. So in excess, when there is a lot of protein, and this is especially true for low carb diets, things like ketogenic and carnivore, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the podcast. When there is not a lot of carbs, which is the preferred source of energy, that's kind of like the preferred method of getting blood sugar to the rest of our cells, protein can actually become and made into glucose. And this is through a process called gluconeogenesis, basically new sugar genesis. And this is done by taking the amino acids, all of the constituents of the protein, and turning it into glucose so that our cells can use what used to be protein and use it as a source of glucose. This is in extreme cases, like I said, with low carb diets where proteins and fats are the only source of fuel that your body has available. But this does have an impact. This can have an impact on your blood sugar on the line. Now, I don't know if anyone here, I'll talk from my personal experience. I'm a weightlifter. I spent a lot of time doing resistance training. And when I was in college as a college athlete, whey protein shakes were a big thing, right? As a means of building muscle and fueling our body. Whey protein shakes spike my blood sugar. Why? Because it's this sudden inrush of protein. Rarely drank it with anything else. And so my body saw that protein shake as the only source of fuel it had available at a very high metabolically demanding time. And so it would convert that protein into glucose, and thus my blood sugar rose. So just an interesting little tidbit here. People think that if you eat protein, you don't have to worry about your blood sugars. Not true. Now, let's also talk about fats, because fats are very important in the realm of diabetes. It's going to be hard when you look in the mainstream narrative to find the constructive information, because what you'll find is largely like, oh, fats are bad. Too much fat leads to insulin resistance, what have you. It's not that straightforward. So the primary effect of fats on our blood sugar is that they don't raise them directly, right? They're kind of like protein in that they help slow the digestion of carbohydrates. They kind of work together with carbs to make sure that things aren't being pushed through our digestive system too quickly and adversely impacting our blood sugar. So this can lead to a more gradual release. It lets your insulin work a little bit faster. It doesn't make your insulin have to work so fast. It prevents spikes, what have you. Now, there are different kinds of fats. Saturated fats, this is going to be things like butter, things that are stable at room temperature. So coconut oil has some saturated fat in it. It's mostly monounsaturated fats, I believe. Tallow is a saturated fat. But there are also unsaturated fats. You've got monounsaturated fats, like I mentioned, with coconut oil, and then polyunsaturated fats as well. These are the liquid oils at room temperature. These are the seed oils, processed oils, things like olive oil, things like avocado oils, canola oil, vegetable oil, sesame oil, you name it. The tidbit there at the end, diets high in processed fats can worsen insulin resistance and inflammation, particularly in individuals with type 1. A high-fat diet needs to consider necessary supporting nutrients to ensure proper fat utilization and active oxygen species disposal. Now, this is an important point when it comes to fat digestion, because we'll hear all the success stories from ketogenic diets and carnivore diets, which are high-protein, high-fat diets, on blood sugar. But then we'll also simultaneously, in mostly the type 2 world, honestly, that if you have too much fat in your diet, this is going to negatively impact your body's ability to use insulin. So it's kind of confusing to have information on both of those ends. What it comes down to is the quality of the fat that you're eating. Saturated fats can be a very good thing for your body if you have the means of properly using it. This has to do with the cleanliness of your liver, the cleanliness of your GI tract, so that your body has all of the tools to properly use it. And to that last point, you also need specific vitamins and minerals to properly metabolize those fats. So the anti-fat campaign in the diabetes world, in my opinion, boils down to basically malnutrition. It's eating a lot of fat without any of the proper tools to properly use it. Okay. Then on the carnivore and ketogenic side, it's a lot of fat and a lot of protein. And people think, oh, because it's not a direct carb, that means it's not going to impact my blood sugar, so I can just, go on and won't have to worry about it. Not necessarily the case, because of gluconeogenesis and its ability to turn that protein into glucose. All right. And to that point about those other nutrients, don't let the macros steal all the attention, right? We need to make sure that we're getting the other stuff that our body needs to properly use glucose, protein, and fats. Magnesium is a major mineral in all of that. Okay. I want to say magnesium is used in every enzymatic process required for metabolizing glucose. So if you don't have enough magnesium, it means that your body isn't operating at maximum capacity when it comes to properly using that sugar and moving it through your digestive system. Those fat-soluble vitamins, vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K, those are going to help your liver, right? Those are going to help your liver properly digest fats by the release of bile. It's going to help store glycogen properly and interact with your pancreas in a better way to better stabilize blood sugars. And then trace minerals, zinc, copper, chromium, selenium, manganese. These are very important in our body's natural ability to handle inflammation and properly digest foods, kind of on the greater grand scheme of the digestive system as a whole, but also at the cellular level for the tract of your digestive system, the beta cells themselves, the alpha cells themselves, as well as your liver cells. Electrolyte balance, sodium, potassium, calcium, these are all important for basic cellular dynamics and making sure that membrane potentials are working properly, and that all of the food can be absorbed properly. All of the cells, when that food becomes available to the cell, can be used properly, and then all of the antioxidants in those plants to help your body get rid of all of the waste when it comes to that, because waste disposal also has a major part in all of this.
So now that we've got a little bit of a better profile for those carbs, proteins, and fats, let's start to talk about what happens when you start to combine them.
And it's important to know that your meal, the quality of your meal in regards to the nutrients it supplies to your body, is much greater than the sum of its parts. Because when you combine macronutrients, carbs, proteins, fats, they interact to help your body better stabilize blood sugars. So when you pair carbs with proteins and with fats, it slows digestion, it slows glucose absorption, and prevents those blood sugar spikes. Now, unless in extreme conditions, let's say you have a low blood sugar, that's when your body's like, oh my God, I need sugar now. But other than that, it's never really a good idea to have a carb-only snack. Things like potato chips, things like, just a slice of white bread. Always combine something like that. Again, we shouldn't be eating unbleached or unenriched wheat flour, but besides the point, let's say it's sourdough. It's never really good to eat just that. Combine it with a source of protein or a source of fat that is going to help slow your body's digestion, that quick digestion of the sugar source, so that your blood sugar doesn't shoot to the roof, right? And this could be nut butter, peanut butter, almond butter. Some people do cheese. You could do cheese and crackers instead of just the crackers themselves. Plenty of ways to work around that. So in addition to stabilizing blood sugars, protein and fat work alongside fiber, which again is technically glucose. It's just in a way that your body has to work really hard to get anything out of. It's going to prolong your satiety. And satiety is just a fancy word for how long you feel full. So proteins and fats help you feel full longer. And as someone who's had diabetes for a long time, it's hard to feel full. It really is. And we'll talk more about the science behind it later in the podcast. But when you are eating carbs only, like let's say you have, two handfuls of tortilla chips. I'll use that as an example. In about 10 minutes, you are going to feel like you never ate anything. You're just as hungry as when you started eating before. And that's because of that kind of like loaded carb, minimal protein and fat. When you have fiber, when you have fats and proteins, you're going to experience that sense of fullness more than if you just had carbs, or you just had one of those categories. And portion control, right? And like I mentioned, people with diabetes are at a little bit of a disadvantage when it comes to feeling that fullness from a hormonal standpoint. But when you introduce these extra components, proteins, fats, and fiber, this is going to slow how your body is using that glucose, and it's going to prevent those unnecessary blood sugar elevations. It's going to give your body time to use the insulin and prevent the resulting roller coaster. Okay. Now, meat. There are some people in the world of diabetes who say carnivore works best, ketogenic works best. Ketogenic is a low carb, high protein, moderate protein, high fat diet. I'm not here to choose, vegetarian, plant-based, carnivore, keto. I eat meat myself, but it's important to understand what you're looking for in your meat as a protein and a fat source. So obviously grass-fed, grass-finished, as clean as you can get it. There's a lot of different, like pasture-raised, farm-raised eggs. Some companies are lying about it. It doesn't mean what you think it means. Just get as clean a meat as you possibly can. This all has to do with the fact that you end up absorbing what your animal ate, right? So if your animal just ate a bunch of like hydrogenated oil and pesticide, herbicide ridden GMO crops, that means that you're eating it disguised as a piece of meat. So you need to make sure that you're paying attention to the source of your meat as well. But from a fat and a protein standpoint, we need to be mindful of the content of our meat sources, right? So this could be a fat heavy cut, whether it's a well marbled piece of steak or like a lean chicken breast. Even chicken breasts, which is lower in fat versus a high fat chicken thigh. You have to respond accordingly with how you pair it with the rest of your meal, right? Because if you're eating, let's say, pork belly, I don't want you to think like, oh, well, here's my meat for the dish. I got plenty of protein. Pork belly is mainly fat. There's not a whole lot of protein to it. So you need to make sure that you are accommodating for that by getting protein from another source. Same goes for chicken breast. Oh, well, meat has plenty of fat and plenty of protein. When I eat my chicken breast, I don't have to worry about the fat source. No, because chicken breast is very lean. It should be, you can cook it with butter, you can cook it with olive oil, coat it in nuts, whatever. So make sure that you're paying attention to the type of meat, the cut of meat, and how your meat is being sourced. That being said, I personally like including meat because I like the taste, but also because of the balance of micronutrients, the vitamins included within the meat that is going to help my body better use it. So iron, copper, zinc, vitamin A, those are all very abundant in a lot of meat sources. The complete protein, all 9 essential amino acids in most of them. So your body gets a lot of bang for its buck when it comes to meat. You just got to pay attention to how it's sourced and the composition of the meat itself. And then, being mindful of the vegetarian, the vegan, the plant-based perspective, there are plenty of ways to compose your meal in a way that is going to get you a lot of the vitamins and minerals. Let's see if I can go back. In the vitamins and minerals, like all here, the complete proteins that you would get in meat. So it has to do with combining, right? So legumes on the left-hand side are kind of like the staple here. And then on the right side of the screen, you have options as to what you can pair them with to get the most out of the dish as a whole, right? So legumes, these are your beans: black beans, kidney beans, chickpeas, lentils, peanuts, navy beans, pinto beans, lima beans, split peas, right? Any kind of bean. And remember, peanuts are technically beans. They're a legume, rather. So these are all great sources of minerals, great sources of protein, plant protein. Now, when you mix them with grains, seeds, and nuts, it's taking that amino acid profile, the protein amounts in the beans, and making it more bioavailable, making it more complete. So you're getting more out of each of the food types that you're working with. Now, for grains, usually, historically, I'm not a huge fan of most grains because when people think of grains, they think of wheat and corn. And these are the most messed with foods on the planet from an enrichment and fortification standpoint, from an herbicide and pesticide standpoint, glyphosate specifically. So you need to be mindful of how it's sourced, the same way you would be for your meat and how it's treated and raised. So oats, rice, rye, buckwheat, quinoa, amaranth, barley, these are all grains that have a better profile than kind of like your mainstream mass-produced grains. You still need to be mindful of how it's sourced and how it's treated, but it's going to be better. And again, some of these grains will work better than others. Rice, personally, messes with my blood sugar so much. I've mainly avoided it entirely. I stick with quinoa and buckwheat. Those are my go-tos. From a seed standpoint, pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds, sesame seeds, flax seeds, hemp seeds. They're a great source of a lot of trace minerals. They've got a lot of good fats, a lot of good proteins, and plenty of glucose. You also need to be mindful of glucose when it comes to seeds. A lot of people think, oh, well, it's mostly fat, it's mostly protein. Not necessarily. Be mindful of the carb count when it comes to seeds. And then nuts, almonds, Brazil nuts, hazelnuts, coconut, cashews, pistachio, walnut. Oh, I love nuts. Just saying that list made me hungry. A lot of great plant compounds, a lot of great healthy fats and trace minerals. Even better when you combine them with those beans. Here are just some examples. We'll go through a three-course meal with 3 different options. Just some examples of how you compare these things. So oatmeal, almond butter, and chia seeds, right? Oats are going to be your carb source. They're also a great source of fiber, right? Fiber is going to help slow that glucose spike after the meal. Fiber, healthy fats, protein, almond butter, chia seeds. Chia seeds also have a lot of great omega-3s. They're also a great source of fiber. Greek yogurt, berries, walnuts. Again, you can kind of piece together the profile here. Those berries, dark berries, are going to be more antioxidant rich. Raspberries, blueberries, blackberries, what have you. Strawberries as well. But you can piece it together the way it works best for you. Walnuts are going to have healthy fats. Greek yogurt's going to have plenty of protein. They're working together to get you the most out of the food. Whole grain toast, avocado, and eggs. Again, I'm not big on bread, just from the flour standpoint. If I do eat bread, it's going to be something that's unbleached, unenriched, preferably sourdough because it's fermented. If you just have a slice of bread, the blood sugar spike is going to be less when you combine it with a fiber and fat and protein-rich food like avocado and eggs. When it comes to lunch, again, I'm hungry just reading this stuff. So quinoa salad, grilled chicken, olive oil dressing, right? So quinoa, that's your core, that's your carb, that's your fiber. You've got grilled chicken, that's going to be your protein source. And remember, chicken breast is very lean, so mix it with some olive oil, maybe some vinegar, a little mustard. You can get creative with it. And spice, please, God, for the love of God, don't forget spice. Turmeric, black pepper. Don't be afraid of salt. Preferably use sea salt. Spice, thyme, oregano, rosemary, all of it. Brown rice, sauteed vegetables, and salmon. Again, if you can tolerate rice, you can mitigate a lot of the spike in rice if you season it, right? If you go salt, pepper, olive oil, you could do turmeric rice as well. You're getting fiber-rich vegetables. I find vegetables allow me to increase the volume of what I'm eating and give me that sensation of fullness without loading myself up on carbs. So it can help. Then you've got a piece of bread with turkey, hummus, and spinach on it, right? You can make your own sandwich here. Sourdough gives you that fermented grain, unenriched, unfortified, and turkey and hummus are giving you that complete protein. Dinner, same sort of thing here. Sweet potato, steak, and steamed broccoli. You're touching on those 3 things, combining them in a way that's going to work better for you than if you were to eat either one of them in isolation. Lentil soup with some bread and avocado. You could do any kind of soup. Soup is such a great thing for diabetes because It's fun to make. You get to decide what actually goes into it and watch it come together. Yeah, any kind of bean for that soup. It doesn't have to be just lentils. That's just a plant-based option. Zucchini noodles, super underrated as a pasta replacement. I don't eat a lot of pasta. I don't eat any pasta, to be honest. Zucchini noodles are my go-to for that because it gives you that volume. You're getting all of the nutrients that you get with plants. You're getting the volume that you would from a pasta dish, and without any of the carb load that you would with pasta. Ground turkey, pesto sauce. Get creative with your sauces. It can really, really help spice up your meals and prevent boredom when it comes to food.
So now that we've created profiles and understood how each of the macronutrients factor into blood sugar control, let's take a look at some of the dietary aspects that come with low carb approaches like ketogenic or carnivore. It requires us to take a deeper look at something called gluconeogenesis. It's a cool way that our body makes fuel from things that aren't glucose. And it's something that we all need to know about as people with diabetes, with all of this circulation around high carb, low carb, high fat, low fat.
So gluconeogenesis is by definition the process by which the body produces glucose from non-carbohydrate sources, primarily in the liver. These key sources can be proteins and their amino acids, fats, and specific portions of those triglycerides, as well as lactate, which is from anaerobic exercise. Everyone kind of knows the soreness you experience after a workout, that buildup of lactic acid. Lactate is a part of that. That can actually be turned into fuel through gluconeogenesis. Just an interesting little tidbit there. But why does it actually happen? So gluconeogenesis ensures a steady supply of glucose for the essential organs like the brain, especially during fasting or low carb intake, right? So in states where our body is running low on its fuel of choice, which is glucose, it has the ability to turn things that are not glucose into glucose. This is part of the reason why you experience dawn phenomenon. So dawn phenomenon is that early morning spike that a lot of people with diabetes experience right as they wake up or as they begin to start their day. And this has to do with this, can involve gluconeogenesis. It can involve with glycogen release. There's a couple different ways that it can come about. But essentially, you've been fasting all night. You haven't eaten since the last time you ate, 8, 10, 12 hours ago. So when you wake up as part of your circadian rhythm, your liver knows that you need a little bump of sugar, of glucose, to get your day started and kind of start the active part of your day. And so your liver is essentially serving you breakfast every morning before you even need to eat anything. So this can happen long fasts. Again, I'm willing to bet that it starts to kick in anywhere after like 16, 18 hours. That's probably when you're getting into peak gluconeogenesis, and it'll only compound after that. Protein meals, again, mentioned with carnivore, that this is going to help spur that gluconeogenesis, especially when there's low carb availability. And then after intense exercise, right, with that lactate being a possible alternative fuel source after extensive exercise, your liver is going to turn that lactate into glucose for your body to actually use. So its impact on blood sugars. Even without consuming carbs, gluconeogenesis can raise your blood sugar. Okay, so I know plenty of people with diabetes get so frustrated. They're like, whether it be a fast or just a long period of time in their day where they haven't eaten, they're like, why would my blood sugar go up? I haven't even eaten any carbs. This is because in that fasted state, your liver is turning things into glucose to kind of help facilitate energy within the body. You just don't have the insulin to use it, right? So it can lead to unexpected spikes, especially overnight, like I mentioned before, with dawn phenomenon. So whether or not you are eating carbs, your body knows how to turn stuff that isn't carbs into carbs. So you need to be mindful of that, whether you're fasted, whether you're on a low carb diet, what have you. Regardless of whether you're eating your sugar or your body is converting things that you do eat into sugar, you're going to need insulin to make sure that it's being used properly by the cell. Personal little tidbit, I have tried ketogenic several times. I think I went 6 months, my early 20s, and then I tried it for a period of time after that, 3 or 4 months. I really enjoyed it, to be honest, in terms of like the food selection, my energy, the weight. I felt good. They were my worst A1Cs. I was in like the mid to high eights. And because I was of the mindset, well, I'm not eating a lot of carbs, I probably don't need to be worrying about it. And I just was not being very good at having diabetes and wasn't properly tracking my blood sugars. But just, again, even for those who are interested in ketogenic and carnivore as a means of blood sugar management, you still need to be mindful of your blood sugars. You still need to make sure that you're using the appropriate amount of insulin. It may be less insulin, but you're still going to need some. It can really mess with your blood sugars. So, ways to manage gluconeogenesis, whether you want to get it started on those carnivore and ketogenic diets, or you're trying to prevent it from happening. Composition, right? Pair your proteins with fat and fiber to make sure that you're slowing glucose release. Even if you are ketogenic or carnivore, you need to make sure that you're getting some source of fiber in there. That can kind of help the movement of food. Basal insulin, so basal rates for pump users, if you're using long lasting as someone who's using an MDI or injections. Your basal rates and your long lasting are meant to accommodate that slow release of glycogen, that kind of like baseline release from non-carbohydrate sources. So if you are in a fasted state, it may be beneficial for you to monitor your basal rates and see if you need to increase or decrease depending on where you are along your fast. So make sure, even if you're not doing anything in particular dietarily, monitoring your nighttime numbers is going to give you some insight into how your body and your insulin levels operate during that fasted state when you're turning not carbs into carbs. Obviously, track your patterns, right? You'll start to realize your body, and this is the importance of routine as well. You get to learn a little bit more about how your body operates for a long period of time. If you have a CGM, identify those trends and how you operate, and then make adjustments accordingly. Your basal rates or your carb to unit ratio. Exercise timing. So you want to avoid protein meals immediately after intense workouts if you notice those spikes, because again, those really intense exercise are going to cause your body to turn that lactate into glucose, and then you compound that with protein. Again, you're giving that gluconeogenesis cycle multiple sources of fuel to turn into glucose. And this is going to be just a little bit different for everyone. Obviously, pay attention to your unique condition. Made sure I always bolus just a little bit after that exercise to see how my body operated, because physical activity can also increase your sensitivity to insulin at the same time. So yes, you are producing more glucose, but you're also becoming more insulin sensitive. So those two can kind of cancel themselves out. I don't want anyone to think, oh, well, I exercised, I've got to give myself extra insulin here. Always be mindful of what your numbers are telling you in the moment. Don't try to read into anything too much. Just, over time, you'll learn what works best for you. So looking at the specifics of ketogenic and carnivore diets. So the pros: stabilize blood sugars because you're having that low carb intake. You're not having those immediate spikes. Gluconeogenesis is going to take a little bit more time in terms of turning proteins and fats into glucose. Immediate reduced insulin needs and improved insulin sensitivity. This can also change over time as well. I've heard people in using both of those diets have worsened insulin sensitivity. It really depends on their state of inflammation, right? You can be eating carnivore but still be engaged in some inflammatory habits. You just need to be paying attention to your unique situation. Then obviously the potential benefits for weight management and energy levels, because now you're using fat as a source of energy, a primary source of energy. You're going to be burning body fat instead of the immediate food intake as if you were consuming glucose. So those are the pros. Cons, because when people start this, it takes time for them to adjust out of their usual insulin routine. So if you go ketogenic, if you go carnivore, but you keep the basal rates that you had when you weren't, you need to make sure that your blood sugar is not going too low or too high, depending on how you ramp yourself up to either or. Cons: nutrient imbalances and reduced variety in micronutrient intake. Got to make sure you're getting fiber. Obviously, meats specifically as a protein and a fat source, they have a very rich nutrient profile, but they don't have everything, right? There are plant sources of nutrients that are going to help complement those found in meat. You just eat meat or you just eat very fatty, low carb meals, you may be missing out on some of the nutrients necessary to properly utilize the nutrients in the fat and the protein. Okay. There are concerns about long-term sustainability. I'm not here to comment on them. This is all just an experiment for everyone. If it works for you, I'm glad. If it doesn't, it doesn't matter. You can choose something else. This is just find what works best for you. Make sure you're covering as many bases as are there. Be ready to adjust as you go. There was a time where I was like, oh my God, ketogenic is the best. I wanted to tell everyone and their mother about it. And then I just learned more about it, found out I wanted to try something else, and I moved on from it. I haven't gone back since, but I get it. Okay. And at the bottom there in the smaller text there, who might benefit? Now, I think ketogenic and carnivore have their greatest benefit for people who are in the early stages of addressing inflammation. I will say that the protein and fat-rich foods tend to be less meddled with from a artificial enrichment and fortification standpoint, and as well as herbicides and pesticides. So you're kind of removing a lot of that junk and that noise that you're getting from carb-containing foods. That can be a good thing in terms of calming the waters of inflammation. Long term, though, now you need to start to consider what the nutrient profile is and the good things. Just because there were some bad things in those carb-containing foods doesn't mean you aren't going to miss the good things that were there. So you need to be mindful of both of those moving forward.
All right, so now that we've covered the macronutrients themselves, how our body handles them together, as well as kind of those low-carb, ketogenic, gluconeogenesis type models, let's focus on the actual hardware here, right? We've mentioned a bunch about stuff going on in the liver, fiber affecting how food moves through the GI tract. Let's talk about the actual organs themselves, so the liver and the GI tract specifically, and how they're impacting how we absorb the food and its relationship with our blood sugars.
All right, so let's start with the liver's role in blood sugar control, and it's got a big one. So the key functions of the liver: it stores glucose as glycogen and releases it when blood sugar drops. This is the role of the alpha cell, opposite the beta cell, in the pancreas. The alpha cell releases glucagon, which communicates with the liver that we need a bump in our blood sugar, right? So then the liver, which is the storage site for glycogen, which is those long chains of glucose, it releases those into the bloodstream and raises them. In a healthy system, if after exercise, a long-term fast, this is basically the raise blood sugar button. That's all coming from the liver. The liver also produces glucose through gluconeogenesis, which we talked about. Liver is also a filter, right? So it's detoxing harmful substances influenced by dietary choices. It's basically taking on the chin those pesticides, those herbicides, all of the bacteria and viruses that are in our food that were, parasites, what have you. It's basically the stopgap that is grabbing all of those things and getting rid of them through the GI tract. Also, from a digestion standpoint, the liver is what makes bile. Bile is responsible for the digestion of fat and the proper excretion of harmful substances into the GI tract. So liver is just such an important organ. It helps metabolize fat. It catches all the bad things and helps you get rid of it. From a food standpoint, high sugar and or high fat diets, especially when you combine high sugar, high fat, can lead to fatty liver disease, right? And if the liver tissue is compromised in any way, whether it be calcification, fibrosis, lipofuscin, this is going to affect its ability to do its job, okay? And if it can't do its job right, everything downstream of the liver, which is just about everything in the body, is not going to be starting to accumulate some of those toxins or miss out on some of the nutrients that are responsible for the liver to collect. So you need to make sure that you're taking care of your liver. How do you take care of your liver? First off, fiber. Vegetables, fruits, whole grains, these are going to help aid liver detoxification. Part of this has to do with the speed of digestion, right? So if you don't have enough fiber in your diet, this can cause things to move too quickly through your GI tract. If things are moving too quickly through your GI tract, it's going to be harder for the filter to do its job, right? Because things are just moving too quickly. It's not able to grab everything that it needs to. Fat-soluble vitamins and healthy fats, right? Because there is such a unique relationship between the liver and fat metabolization and storage, you need to make sure that you're taking in well-sourced or omega-3s. Again, make sure that it is well-sourced. I like whole food sources for omega-3s, salmon, walnuts, flax seeds. These are all things that are going to deliver the nutrients that help your liver fight inflammation. Vitamin A, retinol, again, from whole food sources is such an important molecule, and this has a lot to do with iron metabolism, which I'm a personal fan of, but cod liver oil and organ meat, beef liver capsules, however it is that you're getting that organ meat, it's an excellent source of very liver-friendly food. And an interesting note, the liver loves bitter foods. It helps with digestion. It helps the liver clean itself better. There's a lot of things to it that I don't fully understand, but bitter is very good for the liver. And these are just a few examples of some bitter foods. And it's an easy Google search if you wanted to look up more options. Bitter melon, mustard greens, dandelion greens, ginger, grapefruit, Brussels sprouts, hickory root, apple cider vinegar. These are all things that do excellent things for your liver and its ability to digest the things that it needs to. Okay? So make sure that in your meal composition and how you stack your fats, proteins, and carbs, that you're mixing in some of that. And this is the importance for me of including that vegetable element, because you're going to get a lot of those plant compounds and vitamins and minerals that you're going to miss out on. Fiber as well, just those high fat diets. So let's move now from the liver, which is kind of packaging things up for metabolism, to the actual GI tract, which is where things are getting absorbed and how things are getting excreted. So how the gut affects blood sugar. Same thing. It slows things down, right? The methodical, it's called peristalsis, but the methodical massaging of food through the GI tract, That's going to dictate how fast food moves through it. So things like fiber and fats are going to slow how food moves through. The slower it moves through, especially in the case of diabetes, it's going to decrease those blood sugar spikes. Obviously, the microbiome, the gut bacteria, the healthy strains that are going to help us get the most out of our foods. They're going to ferment foods and create postbiotics that are going to create hormones that help our body. Again, GLP-1, which is a major component of the pharmaceutical realm of managing diabetes. Our body makes its own GLP-1, and our body's natural creation of it is a result of a healthy gut microbiome. Huge part in reinstating insulin production for people with diabetes. And obviously, a healthy gut is one that's going to digest food better. It's going to absorb nutrients better. It's going to provide all the things that our cells are asking for from an energy standpoint. So obviously, from a food standpoint, we need to give it better things to take better care. Processed foods, the high sugar, the preservatives, dyes, herbicides, pesticides, you name it. These are all things that are going to adversely affect our gut microbiome and leave us either vulnerable to outside inflammation or actually create inflammation in our guts. Again, endogenous inflammatory response is our body telling us something is wrong. And lots of the times I would argue it's telling us something is wrong because what we're feeding it is no good. So ways to help mitigate that: high fiber diets. And depending on where you are on that inflammatory scale, if your gut is just torn to shreds, high fiber can actually hurt a little bit. You would probably want to pace yourself from a fiber standpoint, just because fiber itself is rough. It's roughage, and so it's going to kind of scrape the inflamed tissue, which is not always a good thing. So you need to make sure that you're doing the best you can to fight inflammation, as well as introduce fiber at a healthy rate. So that's going to help gut flora. It's going to help improve blood sugar stability. So gut-friendly foods. You want to get prebiotic-rich foods, right? Prebiotics are the foods that our bacteria feed on. Garlic, onions, bananas. These are all great foods that contribute to healthy gut microbiomes. Specific compounds you'll see at the bottom there. Inulin. Inulin is found in artichokes. It's found in chicory root. It is a very useful and delicious compound that our gut microbiomes love. You can buy it as a supplement. I use it every day. Just a powder, slightly sweet powder that you can mix into just about anything. Psyllium husk is another one. It's a source of great both prebiotics and probiotics. Slippery elm, same thing. It's a prebiotic and probiotic that's going to help move things along in your gut. Probiotic foods. This probiotic means it's the source of the bacteria itself. So fermented foods, yogurt, kefir is a fermented dairy product. Kimchi, sauerkraut, cabbage. I don't know what it is about fermented cabbage, but it's very, very good for your gut. So make sure that you're implementing some of those to make sure that you are introducing the gut bacteria as well as the food necessary to sustain them. And then soluble fiber, again, this is another form of fiber that's going to serve as a food source for the bacteria in your guts. Oats, beans, apples happen to have a lot of soluble fiber as well. This can help slow the digestion, make sure that your gut bacteria have enough time to absorb all of the nutrients that it needs to produce the hormones and byproducts our body needs. And then when you combine the two, right, so we've got all of the things that make our liver happy, all the things that make our gut happy. You've got a happy liver and a happy gut. How are they working together, right? So the gut and the liver communicate regularly to manage your metabolism, right? Do we have enough energy to do the things we need to do today? Is there anything out of whack that needs to be paid attention to in terms of managing inflammation, the liver and the gut are two major players in how that happens, because the liver is the filter. It's catching things that inflame and it's passing them on to the gut so that it can get excreted through your poop. So if the gut is taking on a huge inflammatory load as a result of the liver not being able to do its job, there's going to be a lot of hormonal communication to try and get that to solve itself. So poor gut health can increase liver stress because the gut isn't making the right hormones to help regulate blood sugar, whether it be, that GLP-1 component. This can lead to impaired glucose control, and vice versa. Poor liver function can leave the gut vulnerable to toxin overload because the liver isn't able to catch everything that it needs to. That means what it doesn't catch is being dumped into the gut, where it's causing even further inflammation. So we need to be paying attention to our fiber. We need to be paying attention to our carb content and balancing everything so that both can handle things adequately and enjoy a happy, healthy relationship.
And next, we're going to talk about the glycemic index, which is a numerical scale that is measuring the effect that food has on our blood sugar. So let's get into that real quick.
So for those that are unfamiliar, the glycemic index ranks food based on how quickly they raise your blood sugar levels compared to pure glucose, if you were to just take regular sugar. And it's scored as 100. So a low GI, or a low glycemic index, means that it's going to have a slower, more steady increase in your blood sugar, right? So low GI foods are foods that move more slowly, have less of an immediate impact on your blood sugars. Medium GI is a moderate rise, and then if it's a high glycemic food, that means it's going to spike your blood sugar more quickly. So 55 and less is low. Anywhere from the mid 50s to the probably mid 70s is going to be moderate. And then anything 70 and above is going to be a high glycemic index food. So here are some examples. Low GI foods: non-starchy vegetables, broccoli, spinach, beans, lentils, chickpeas, pinto beans, black beans, what have you, and whole grains like quinoa, barley, oats. Think of the nutrient profile for these, and I have some questions there on the right side. Just consider each of those. So low glycemic index foods, those are kind of the quote-unquote healthy foods that we think of. Medium GI foods: so sweet potatoes, bananas, basmati rice. These are some of the more carb-heavy foods. Again, they still have other beneficial properties. Sweet potatoes have a bunch of minerals, a bunch of fiber. Bananas, same thing, a lot of fiber, a lot of minerals. Basmati rice, a little bit more starch and carb heavy, but not quite just pure sugar itself. So there are things to slow down the spike, but it's still going to be a little bit more rapid than that low GI section. And then down at the bottom, high glycemic index foods: white bread, sugary cereals, watermelon. I don't know why they throw watermelon under the bus like this, but there are some fruits, right? I think pineapple is one of them. It's really, really sugar forward, really, really heavy on the carbs up front, with less fiber, less protein, less micronutrients to slow the absorption of that glucose. So high glycemic foods are a lot of the processed foods that you see: enriched wheat flour, sugar, artificial sweeteners. All of those can be high glycemic index foods. But to the points to my right here, think about the nutrient profile of each level, and what do you think is impacting the balances of the foods and their GI effects, right? Low glycemic index, not as high in the carb department, very high in the fiber and the nutrient department, right? So, and then medium GI foods, more sugar and a little bit, moderate nutrient and fiber. And then the high GI foods is all sugar, nothing to slow it down, next to no fiber, next to no micronutrients, right? So you can kind of think of that as a balancing scale. The low GI is going to be high micronutrient, high fiber, lower carb, moderate, and then the high GI foods, more carbs, less micronutrients. So again, I'm not telling you not to eat watermelon, not to eat pineapple. They all have their place, but that comes back to the what are you eating it with, and how can you mitigate that immediate blood glucose spike, whether it be insulin or the foods that you can eat with it to help slow it down as it moves through your GI tract. So why does it matter? Obviously, the impact on your blood sugar. The low glycemic index foods are going to have less of an impact, not zero. Like they'll still raise your blood sugar if you're not paying attention, but it will be much slower than if you were a high glycemic index food, because those high GI foods are going to cause a rapid increase. When you eat more low glycemic index foods, your blood sugar will be inherently better because the food is moving more slowly. The insulin has more time to take effect. And thus, the better your blood sugars are, the less long-term complications you're at risk of experiencing, and the less roller coaster rides, right? If you're eating high glycemic index foods, you see your blood sugar spike, you're like, oh my God, I got to give myself all the insulin. So you give yourself that whole lot of insulin. It brings that spike back down, but because you bolused to accommodate for that rapid spike, you gave too much, and then you go back down. And then you got to eat something to bring yourself back up, and then and it's just too much. Low glycemic index foods are the best way to avoid that. However, there are some limitations to that glycemic index scale, and it's not something to live or die by. Portion size matters, right? So some people say, oh, well, if it's a low glycemic index food, it's not going to bother my blood sugar at all. If you eat a whole lot of it, it's still going to have an adverse effect on your blood sugar. You still need to make sure that you're giving yourself adequate insulin to accommodate that slower spike. GI, lower glycemic index, or not lower, but the GI index does not account for combining foods, right? So like you could look at a plate and it's got one high glycemic index food on it. You could be like, oh, I can't eat this. It's got a high GI food. But when you think about all of the low GI options that are slowing that glucose absorption, like fiber, like fat, like protein, there are there's some nuance to that GI scale that that putting individual labels on food isn't acknowledging. And obviously processing and ripeness. So how you cook it and the ripeness of the food that you cook is going to impact the glycemic index. Starchy green bananas have a much lower glycemic index than ripe or overripe bananas. That just has to do with the fiber content and the glucose availability. Pre-ripe green bananas have a lot more fiber, a lot less sugar. Overripe bananas have a lot more sugar, a lot less fiber. That's going to skew the GI scale. So practical tips. Make sure that if you are going to eat a high glycemic index food, make sure that you've got a low GI index food around so that you can help mitigate that blood sugar spike. Eating whole foods is chef's kiss. That's what's going to be the savior here. Make sure that you're getting enough fiber, micronutrients, fat, protein to help mitigate those blood sugar risks. All right. For an example, rice bowls are very popular just in kind of like the fast food and takeout. Make your own, first of all, so that you know what the ingredients are. But if rice is going to give you a problem, swap a lower glycemic index option to help mitigate that spike. I use quinoa for just about anything I would rice these days. So keep that in mind.
Next, let's talk about meal timing and how when we're eating and how closely together we're eating between meals has an impact on blood sugars. This is something near and dear to my heart because over my 23 years with type 1, I've spent a lot of time experimenting with this and finding what works best for me. Let's get into it.
All right, so let's talk about why meal timing matters, why consistent eating patterns can help with your blood sugars. Now, you have to consider here the circadian rhythm aspect of energy utilization as well. Like we mentioned with dawn phenomenon, when you wake up, when the sun hits your eyes, hits your skin, This is a sign that the day has begun and your body is going to need more energy than when it was asleep. So we need to take that into consideration when we start to eat food and use insulin to help use the food that we eat. So eating consistently, and again, we'll talk more about the timing of things in just a little bit, but being consistent in your eating patterns can help maintain steady blood sugar levels. It can optimize your insulin effectiveness from an insulin sensitivity standpoint as well as an insulin resistance standpoint. And it can prevent those roller coaster rides of a hyper, then a hypo, a hyper, then a hypo. And the kind of like sporadic, irregular eating patterns lead to unpredictable blood sugar fluctuations. Just think of the circumstances in your day that lead you to eat irregularly, right? Most of them are going to have some sort of stress event tied to it. Cortisol is going to increase your blood sugar. It's going to increase your insulin resistance. The decisions that you're making in those times of stress are usually going to be for worse food options, right? Like when you're knocked out of your rhythm of things when it comes to eating, you're a lot more likely to make poor food decisions. So just be mindful of that when it comes to creating consistent eating pattern. So best practices for meal timing. And this is like, I'm treading lightly here because again, there are so many different options. And I've heard of so many different success stories and failure stories from people with diabetes. I really don't think that there is a one size fits all. The thing is, you got to be consistent. People intermittent fast, they'll go the 16 hours off, 8 hours on. I've seen people do one meal a day and have success with it. It's just about being consistent and giving your body adequate time to adapt to whatever system that it is that you're trying. Because I don't at all think either that you should just pick one and be done with it and just be assigned to that the rest of forever just because it worked for you in that time. Experiment a little bit, as much as you're comfortable, but find what works best for you and really settle into it and give it a chance to maximize its potential for you. Another important point when it comes to meal timing, no matter how many meals or snacks you're having a day, make sure that you align those meals to better suit insulin action and sensitivity. And what I mean by this is give your body a chance to properly digest foods and use the insulin that you need to use the food. So for me, this means creating a window of physical activity after meals so that I can move that food around, so I can circulate lymph, so I can circulate my insulin and better regulate my blood sugars. The worst thing that happens to me is that when I eat something and I just sit. So, in college, if I were in a lecture and I needed to sit for an hour and a half at a time, I didn't want to eat directly beforehand because I knew no matter how much insulin I gave myself, that insulin wasn't going to be circulating very well because I was just stagnant sitting in my chair. So make sure that when you eat, you're creating an opportunity for your body to best use the food, best use the insulin. This could mean a smaller meal or a smaller snack before periods of long stagnation. This might mean breaking up long periods of sitting or non-activity with a walk around the block, with jumping jacks or push-ups in your office space. Whatever you need, make sure that you're giving yourself a chance to properly circulate stuff so that your blood sugar doesn't spike as a result of that. This goes for bedtime as well. I try to create at least a 2 to 3 hour buffer where I have not eaten anything. The food that I had for dinner or lunch has had time to kind of settle and move through so that I'm not having to guard against highs, hyperglycemia as I sleep. The worst thing I could do is have to eat something right before I go to bed. I don't like to do that. And then portion control, right? Are we able to push the plate away? This is something I've, as a student, a D1 student athlete, I always, more food was always better because I could build more muscle, I could be stronger, I could be faster, whatever. And I've always kind of naturally tended towards being a skinny kid. But portion control, it helps manage carbohydrate intake, right? We don't want to be taking in more than we're using. That's going to lead to fat mass accumulation. It's also going to lead to a lot more hectic blood sugar spikes and a lot more insulin needed. This is going to prevent over or under eating, depending on how much time between meals you have, and all of that can disrupt our stress hormone and energy balance. So you need to know the carb content of your food. In the early stages of having diabetes, read every nutrition label you possibly can. Build that internal Rolodex of what foods are and what their carb content is. You have to read the ingredient, just while you're there reading the nutrition facts, read the ingredient labels too. Find out what's in it. Find out what could impact how those carbs are used from a dietary standpoint, from a protein standpoint, from a fat standpoint. Use tools, at least in the early stages. Again, I don't use food scales or measuring cups a lot anymore. Kind of like built up a pretty good foundation of what carbs are and how they interact with the things that I combine them with. But food scales, measuring cups, visual guides, like hand, palm, what have you. I remember in my those first few weeks after I was diagnosed, going to school with little Tupperware containers marked with 1 cup equals this many carbs. And that helped me bolus from there on out. But yeah, useful tools. Because, and portion control is so critical for people with diabetes, because what people without diabetes don't realize is that people with diabetes are missing the hormonal feeling of fullness. Okay? So I've spoken about amylin before in previous podcast episodes. I haven't mentioned it yet today, but amylin is a hormone co-secreted with insulin by beta cells. So beta cells actually make 2 hormones. Amylin is responsible for the feeling of satiety and fullness after we eat. It's going to slow how quickly food moves through our stomach and into our small intestine. It does this to help pace the food to match the effect of the insulin, right? Because if we just ate food and it just like slammed into our intestines, our pancreas is going to have to make more and more insulin to accommodate that sudden influx of food. Amylin helps to pace it so that our blood sugars stay nice and steady instead of just going up and down and up and down. With type 1 diabetes, because of our loss of beta cell mass, we have less insulin, obviously, but less amylin as well. So we don't have that signal for I'm full. We don't have the brakes on eating. So what that means is that we have to be our own brakes, right? We're waiting for that feeling of fullness and it never comes, so we keep eating. And if that's the case, we end up overeating because then our only signal for, hey, I'm full, is the literal pressure on our stomach that it can't be filled anymore. And by that time, we've already eaten too much. Things are already backed up. This leads to things like GERD, acid reflux. It can also lead to just adverse blood sugar because that food is now taking longer and longer and longer, and you're having to space your boluses out. What you thought was enough up front turns out not to be enough in the long run because you've just backed up your stomach and your GI tract so much that you need more insulin later down the line. So it's a very, very important point. You are your own full signal. It took me so long to learn this, but you really have to hone in on the fact that I am what is stopping me from eating, not the feeling of fullness. Okay. So here are some of my portion control trips that I use on a regular basis. Have the veggie, have the less carb dense, high nutrient, high fiber part of your meal be the main dish. Have it take up the most volume on your plate. Proteins and starches are accessories and complements to that main dish. A lot of times, we're having steak tonight. Oh, we're having brisket. Oh, I made mashed potatoes. That's the thing that we want to make the star of our plate. No, those are the background dancers to the main star, which is the volume, which is the nutrient dense vegetable part of it. And then from a feeling of fullness, because we don't have that amylin telling us we're actually full, veggies are a great way to get the volume, but not the density, right? So we have a lot of food taking up a lot of space in our stomachs, so we actually feel full, but we're not getting that huge carb overload. And then when it comes to food preparation, be mindful of your pre or post meal bites. I'm as guilty of this 23 years in as anybody. Munching on scraps or little snacks. You open the spice cabinet or a cabinet to help add something to dinner. You see something, you're like, "Ooh, let me just get a little bite of that." Those are all things that add up, right? And when you go and reflect back on your meal, you go, "Oh, well, why are my blood sugars up? I only ate this, this, and this." That was what was on your plate. You ate a little bit before and you ate a little bit after. So just be mindful of those extra little things around mealtime adding up. And don't eat out of the container. This sounds so bad, but when you're kind of just in the rhythm of eating out of the container is going to set you up to eat too much. Whether it be ice cream, whether it be peanut butter, nut butter, anything, dip, hummus, whatever. Give yourself the boundary of a separate dish with a pre-measured amount so that when you are done eating what you gave yourself to eat, that means you're done eating. Okay? Again, this comes with experience. I'm sure everyone will get to, will have a time where they're like, "Hey, I just wanted a spoonful. How did I eat this whole thing?" So make sure that you are setting yourself up for success by pre-measuring and setting things, making sure that the risk of overeating is less and less. And this is also for me too. Number 4, when you're done eating or cleaning up after having prepared your food, get out of the kitchen. Get away from the food. Because what I'll do is I'll hang around and I'll think to myself, I just want a little bit. I just want to. Out of sight, out of mind. Go for a walk. Get outside. Go to another room. The joke is if you hang around the barbershop too long, you might just get a haircut. If you hang around the kitchen after you're done eating, you might just eat more than you're supposed to. So get out of the kitchen when you're done eating. Huge, huge point, and it took me a long time to learn that.
And so that is episode 45, food and blood sugars. We talked all about the profiles of each macronutrient and how they influence our blood sugars. We talked about the micronutrients that are there to help those macros do what they need to do. We talked about combining them all and the different effects they have in properly regulating blood sugar. We talked about gluconeogenesis and how the ketogenic diet and carnivore diets offer a different take on glucose utilization, and how even those with diabetes, even though there aren't any carbs in those diets, we still very much need to pay attention to what we're consuming and how we're using our insulin. We talked about the organs responsible for processing foods. That's the liver and the GI tract, and how important they are for getting the most out of our foods. And as those with diabetes, we need to make sure that they are clean and functioning properly, and how food is one of the major ways to actually do that. We talked about the glycemic index and what that actually means, and how mixing different glycemic index levels can neutralize some of the bad and bring the best out of some of the good, right? And we finished with meal timing and portion control, and how some seemingly maybe not so important things can be very, very important when it comes to blood sugars. So I hope this has been helpful. I can't thank you enough for being here. There's lots of different ways that you can support the channel. You can obviously tell a friend if you know someone with type 1 or who is responsible for someone with type 1. Spread the word. I've got lots of different resources available via Gumroad, a nutrition guide called Diabetic Foodie, as well as a supplement and herbs guide. And then, of course, my ebook, An Ironclad Cause, talking about iron metabolism and its role in the development of diabetes. So, with that, episode 45, again, I'm so glad that you could be here. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.